This report and presentation has been authorised by Dr. Maria Ray-City, Course Coordinator of Marketing of Social Causes at the University of the Sunshine Coast. This presentation has been created to satisfy the requirements of the course with the purpose to develop an innovative ethical intervention plan to address the chosen social cause, the negative stigma associated with mental illness. This presentation has been limited to only using secondary resources of academic and credible sources to complete the report and presentation. This presentation highlights the importance of the social cause, mental illness stigma. The scoping study initially compiles a description of the social cause, the relevant literature and behaviour change theory, and a conceptual model integrating the theoretical concepts and highlighting the intervention to be addressed. The actual intervention is then described, including an evaluation strategy. The associated ethical considerations and potential unintended consequences are further outlined in the report.
The social cause in focus is the negative stigma attached to the mental illness, with those suffering often identified as dangerous or incompetent. This label adds unnecessary stress and drastically reduces the desire for those suffering to seek help. Treatment, employment, income, self-worth, and families of the mental health sufferer are all negatively impacted by the inaccurate representation present in society. There are three types of stigma: perceived stigma, experienced stigma, and self-stigma. Government of Western Australia stated that 3 out of 4 people surveyed have experienced the mental health stigma firsthand. Suicide prevention and coping efforts have noticeably decreased while mental health symptoms have increased, a counteraction closely associated with the stigma surrounding the cause. The sufferer is often left identifying themselves as unusual and different, with treatment being considered frightening as 1 in 5 people admitted to not telling anyone or seeking the correct help. Through literature research, common factors can be identified. Academic literature highlights the controllable and uncontrollable symptoms and characteristics. The 3 factors identified throughout academic literature are fear, authoritarianism, and benevolence. Attribution theory describes the way in which individuals interpret events and how this influences their thinking and behaviour, and this theoretical framework assists in the explanation of the stigma surrounding mental illness in literature. The importance of preventing the development of negative associations in youth and adolescents is stressed, as attitudes are formed from a young age, and this stigma is a major barrier between the use of mental health services among youth. Adolescents link negative stereotypes to one's condition, enforcing emotions such as shame, fear, and secrecy, explaining why youth may hesitate to seek help. Literature focuses on social contact and education as intervention methods in order to improve and potentially eliminate the stigma surrounding mental illness. The conceptual model, based on the ideals of the attribution theory, illustrates what causes people to have stigmatized views and discriminate towards those suffering from mental illness. It shows the relationship between the signaling event, the cognitive mediators, the affective response, and the behavioral reaction. The framework results in an understanding or an acceptance of the problem behavior being the stigma. It is shown that considering symptoms controllable and holding the sufferer responsible can produce negative feelings and perceptions and result in negative stigma. Considering symptoms uncontrollable and not holding the sufferer responsible can result in pity, positive reactions, and helpful behaviour, which can also be accomplished through familiarity with mental illness. The desired outcome is therefore to eliminate the stigma and encourage society towards an understanding and acceptance of mental illness. The stigma surrounding mental illness is a social cause which needs addressing and attention. Stigma can lead to many negative outcomes and should be addressed with a strong focus on the reduction of negative ideologies held by adolescents, as stigma is putting a major barrier between youth and the use of mental health services.
The proposed intervention suggested to reduce mental illness stigma is the creation and implementation of compulsory workshops in all Australian high schools through government funding. The specific target audience as identified is adolescents, those attending high school, with the aim to reduce mental illness stigma from a relatively early age. Academic sources highlight the importance of interpersonal contact and education together to elicit such a change of perceptions, and therefore has been considered in developing an intervention that seeks to be effective in remedying the social cause. The incorporation of education about mental illness as well as social contact through well-known sufferers such as celebrities and sports stars conducting the workshops will ideally remove the stereotypes and preconceived beliefs that many teenagers hold about mental illness, leading them to be more understanding and therefore comfortable seeking help and providing support for sufferers. The workshops would be embedded in the high school curriculum so all adolescents receive the message and hopefully will deter discriminatory behaviour towards those with a mental illness. Highly important stakeholders for this intervention include the students, high school staff, and the speakers carrying out the workshops. Those with a mental illness and their family and friends who are directly and indirectly affected by the negative effects of mental illness stigma, such as prevention of treatment and suicide, are further important stakeholders. Potential partners include organisations such as Beyond Blue, Sane Health, and Headspace, who are a network for support and information about mental illness. Doctors for informational and treatment support, psychiatrists for emotional support, and sufferers of mental illness who can potentially present the workshops are further partners for consideration. Additional potential partners and important stakeholders include Queensland high schools, which are the target of the intervention, and the Australian Government, who can provide funding and encourage regulations. The products can be identified as the social cause in focus, mental illness stigma. There are three layers known as the core, actual, and augmented, which constitute the product. The core layer of the product refers to the desired behaviour, which is evidently the reduction of stigma through changing the perceptions, stereotypes, and the result of discrimination. This desired behaviour and the specific way to achieve this is known as the actual product. The desired behaviour is altering the perception towards mental illness to be accepting and understanding, and will be specifically achieved through the education and interpersonal contact in the workshops. The augmented layer of the product refers to the tangible objects and services which help perform the desired behaviour. The doctors and psychiatrists providing the medical help, as well as the individual speakers conducting the workshops and handouts for students, are involved in the augmented product, which works together to create the desired attitude and behavioural change. The proposed intervention does not have any monetary costs for the target audience, only the non-monetary costs of time and effort. However, this will be implemented during school hours and therefore is not a major barrier. The cost in implementing the intervention will be funded by the Australian Government and will involve the time and effort of speakers conducting the workshops. The place in which the intervention will be carried out is in Queensland high schools. The workshops based on educating students about mental illness will be embedded into the curriculum and therefore compulsory for all students in Years 8 to 12. The workshops will happen at each high school once per term, so 4 times a year, allowing time for speakers to travel to each destination in Queensland.
Media outlets should be utilised in the promotion of the social cause in focus. Advertisements should be played before popular videos on YouTube without the option to skip them, particularly on videos based on topics which are of interest to youth. These topics may include popular music videos, makeup channels, or gaming channels. Campaigns and advertisements should be played on popular television channels in the afternoon on weekdays when students are coming home from school to best reach the target audience. As social media sites are religiously used by adolescents, platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter should be utilised. The following script should be used when the intervention plan is implemented into high school workshops. The workshop hosts ask students what they think mental illness is and what stigma is. Through the use of a motivational media large screen video, a male and a female celebrity or sports person discusses their own personal experience battling mental illness and the stigma associated with it and how they overcome this. Secondly, a parent with a child who suffered from a mental illness discusses how it not only affects the person suffering, but also their families and peers. And thirdly, a high school student who has had a friend commit suicide discusses what it is like to lose someone to mental illness and the consequences of not seeking help. The workshop is then ended with activity questions reiterating what was discussed in the presentation. Examples of these questions may be: what negative effects can come from the stigma surrounding mental illness? How many people would feel more comfortable seeking help if suffering from mental illness after watching the presentation? Or what are examples of stigma?
Evaluating the effectiveness of the intervention proposed will involve gaining feedback from students and teachers, as well as objectively seeking data surrounding mental illness. It is important to note whether the workshops receive a positive response and whether the desired aims of reducing mental illness stigma are being achieved. Surveys and questionnaires should be distributed to students following the workshops to obtain an understanding of the opinions of the target market, whether they found the workshops educational and worthwhile, and whether their opinion towards mental illness has changed. Similar feedback can be gained from teachers with the additional opinion as to whether they have noticed a behavioural change in the students. The intervention will be implemented over 2 years, and therefore data should be collected as to the attitudes held in society towards mental illness at the beginning as well as half year over the 2 years, which will hopefully see a positive change. Discrimination is a prominent ethical consideration that has been acknowledged in forming the intervention. The workshops will seek to not be discriminative or present information which will reflect negatively on mental illness. The workshops will be educational, with information clearly presented in a realistic and considerate manner to avoid the outcome of discrimination. The major potential unintended consequence that has been identified is that the students, being the target audience, may react negatively to the workshop information about mental illness and could seemingly aggravate undesirable feelings of fear and confusion. This could essentially worsen the current problem held as mental illness stigma. However, the interventions have been formulated to ensure this consequence does not occur. The workshops have been designed with a focus on educating on what mental illness is, especially how common, to evoke feelings of normality. There will also be a significant focus on what stigma is and the negative effects that this has. Through the workshops, interpersonal contact through people sharing their experience with mental illness will further work to change the negative perceptions and move towards a greater shared understanding. This education and contact with real-life people, especially well-known figures such as celebrities or sports stars, will evidently be more interesting and effective than solely reading statistics to students. It can be concluded that mental illness stigma is a social cause for concern, with its evident negative impact in society. This justifies the need for the proposed intervention to be implemented, which seeks to change the attitude and behaviour of the target audience, being high school students, to be more accepting and understanding of mental illness, and therefore to remove the negative stereotypes and discrimination. The intervention involves workshops incorporating education as well as interpersonal contact with sufferers as a strategy for stigma reduction. The workshops will happen 4 times a year at each Queensland high school and do not involve any monetary cost for students. Evaluation of the intervention can be achieved through surveys and questionnaires of students and teachers at the high schools to determine whether the response was positive and whether a change in attitudes has occurred. The ethical consideration for discrimination and potential unintended consequence of increasing the negative stigma have been outlined, as well as how the intervention will address and provide benefits that outweigh these.